All right, looks like we're ready to begin. So thank you all for coming to this training session on controlling user scope in Qualtrics. My name is Josh Walthall. I'm a product consultant here at Qualtrics, and I will be the presenter for this training session. Joining us as well is Jacqueline Norcus from the customer support team. Jacqueline will be the moderator for this session. So if you have any questions during this training, please place those into the attendee hub, and Jacqueline will be answering those as we go through training. And then I've also set aside some time at the end to answer some of those questions directly. Okay, so in this training session, what you're going to learn is, first off, what user scope is. We're also going to talk about why user scope is important. And I'll also tell you about some of the integral concepts of controlling user scope in Qualtrics. So first off, what am I talking about? What is user scope? Well, user scope refers to the breadth and depth to which users can access and modify data, manage processes, and configure settings in Qualtrics. So in other words, it's what your users can see and do in your system. And not everyone in your organization needs unlimited access to your system. So you will need to determine and configure the scope for your users in order to get the most out of Qualtrics. So what are the components that make up user scope? Well, user scope is controlled through the assignment and configuration of three categories of things. And those are security/access, permissions, and responsibilities. So I'll talk through what I'm talking about with each of these. With security and access, what I'm talking about is the ability to view and edit folders, documents, reports, workflow definitions, and workflow instances. Permissions are abilities to view additional data and change higher level settings in multiple areas of the system. These are mostly used for admin functions. And then there's also responsibilities, which are basically the duties and tasks that you assign to your users. This could be anything from responsible party for a step of a workflow to being the approver or reviewer of a document, test takers, training attendees, those types of things. So what I want to do first is show you where these things are configured in the system, and then we'll talk some about why it's important to control your user scope. So let me bring out my login to our Qualtrics server here. All right, so we'll start with security and access. And we'll start with documents. When I go into documents here, let's go to the MI6 folder in keeping with the theme of this conference. And I'll go to, let's do the gear folder here. So I'm going to click to select that and click on folder properties. And then I'll go to the security tab. So in this folder, this is where we define the view and edit security for this folder and its contents. So I know this is an advanced session, so I'm not going to dig into the details of how to go through configuring this, but just know that this is one of the places where you can control user scope is through the security settings at the folder properties level. You can see all the groups in the system. We can add them in. We can configure view and edit security. Just know that if someone does not have view security to something, then they can't see it. The folder won't even show up for them. They can't access it. If they have view security, they can see it. If they have view and edit security, then they can see that folder and they can also edit that folder, do things like change the name, reorder the contents, that kind of thing. Now you can also set security at the document level. So if I click on documents and go into that gear folder inside of MI6, and we'll select this bond cars document and click on properties, you can see that it also has its own security tab. And when we go there, we can see the security settings for this document. Now, right now, these settings are the same as the folder level, and I actually can't modify them. And that's just because inherit settings from parent is checked. So if I were to uncheck this, then I could change the security settings for this document on its own. Most of the time, you'll probably want to leave inherit settings from parent on for your document security and to manage that security at the folder level. Usually it's more convenient, but just know that you can also modify this at the document level. You can also configure security for reports. So if I click on reports, you can see we've got the different tabs for the different types of reports. System are those that are loaded in there by default. Then you have document, workflow, test, and training, and these house the different custom reports that you create for those different modules. And you'll see that for each of these reports, there is an edit link as well. And that edit link is going to take us to the settings for the report, including the security settings for it. So if I click on the document activity report, if I click on edit next to that, that'll take me to the security settings there. I can define the security for this report. I can define who can view it, so who can run the report. If I go back to reports and go to one of our custom reports, we'll do this audit report here. Click on edit on that one. You can see there are more tabs, but one of them is security, and you can modify who can view and who can edit. So for custom reports, you can also define edit security. Someone who has view security to the custom report can see it and they can run it. Someone who has view and edit security can run the report, and they can also edit all the settings that we're looking at now. Another place that you can modify access, which is very similar to security, is in workflows. So if I go to administration and click on workflows, we've got a workflow in here for, here we go, gadget request review. So I'm going to click on that. And you can see there's a section for instance access and definition access. Now, right now, this workflow doesn't have a lot configured for that. And your best-in-class workflows as well will sort of start out like this. They'll have definition access for all users, just because with the best-in-class workflows, we don't know what groups are in your system, what users, that kind of thing. So when you bring them in, you'll need to configure them. So make sure to review these settings for the workflows in your system. Let's go back to administration workflows, and I'll use this giant space laser workflow as another example. And here we can see that there are some different things configured for this, and instance access and definition access. So right now the workflow is online, so I can't modify the settings, but if I wanted to, I could take it offline and change these settings here. People who have instance view access will be able to see all instances of this workflow. People who have the view access and edit completed workflows access can also edit the data in the fields in workflows that are completed. You may not use this one very much, but just know that is an option. Definition access is how you control who can view the definition in all of its settings, and then edit security on there is how you control who can modify these settings. So this is another place where you can control user scope, is through workflow definition and instance access. The next component of user scope that I mentioned was permissions. So if we go to administration groups, we can see all the groups in the system. And let's go to this secret agents group. I'm going to right click on this and go to edit properties. And in here I can see all the permissions that are assigned to this group. So this is where I can modify those permissions. If you remember, the permissions that you assign to a group are assigned to every member of that group. Now you can also modify this at an individual level if you need to. If you go to administration personnel, let's go to James Bond here. I'm going to click edit next to his name. There is a permissions tab for users, and you can assign permissions directly to them. Generally speaking, you will want to manage this through groups instead. But again, know that this is an option, and this can affect that user's scope. It will affect that user scope. Assigning permissions directly to someone means that they are independent of groups. So if someone is removed from a group, it doesn't change the permissions that are assigned to them directly. Or to put it another way, someone could be in no groups and still have permissions that they're getting from this setting, from their personnel file directly. So those are the places that you modify permissions. The last category that I told you about was responsibilities. And responsibilities covers a lot of different things. So I'm going to kind of quickly go through these and just show you where they're configured in the system. Again, this is an advanced session, so I'm not going to dig too much into how to do this. I just want to highlight these places so you know exactly where to control user scope. The first type of responsibility I'll highlight is, again, in workflows. So we'll go back to administration workflows. And I'll bring up that giant space laser workflow as an example. So for each of the steps of this workflow, there are responsible parties. That's something you have to define for all the steps in your workflow. On this first step of the workflow, we can see that villains leadership and mad scientist are set as responsible parties for this step of the workflow. The first step of a workflow, whoever the responsible parties are, that's who can launch the workflow. So this is part of user scope. Who can launch these workflows? The responsible parties for the subsequent steps of that workflow are who will be responsible for that step, who will be sent that step when the workflow gets to that step. There's also collaborators, which works very similarly to responsible parties, except that collaborators cannot select routes. They can only view the data that's on that step. They can edit the fields that are editable. They can save changes, but they cannot select routes. But this is another part of user scope that you can control for responsibilities. Another type of responsibility is being the approver or reviewer of documents. So if I click on documents and let's go to that gear folder and click on folder properties, we've got that document list tab. And in here we can define who are the approvers and who are the reviewers. Right now, the director of quality is set as an approver and there are no reviewers. But this is another type of task or responsibility that can be a part of a user scope. And again, much like the security tab, you can set this at the folder level. You can also set this at the document level. If I select a document and click on properties, there's the document list tab there as well, in case you needed it to be different from the folder level. Another type of task and responsibility is tests. So if I go to administration testing, we'll use this deadly lasers test as an example. There is a test takers tab, and that's where you define who will be assigned this test. Very similar thing for training. If I go to administration training, go to World Domination 101, we'll go to training attendees. This is where you define who will be assigned this training. Who are the training attendees? There's also the sign-off personnel tab where you can define who the sign-off personnel are. If we go to the general tab, you can see you can turn on completion sign-off or effectiveness sign-off. These are optional, but completion sign-off means that when the training is submitted, it will go to the completion sign-off personnel for them to confirm that the training was completed. Effectiveness sign-off works in the same way. It's just to confirm that the training was effective. You can use one or both or neither of these, totally optional. But if you do enable these, the sign-off personnel tab is where you'll define what groups are the sign-off personnel. Again, this falls under the user scope. This is part of their scope in the system. All right. So I know that was kind of rapid fire going through these places. I just wanted you to kind of hold in your mind all these places where you can modify these different settings that affect user scope. So now that we've seen that, let's talk a little bit about why user scope is so important. So controlling user scope is a critical piece of managing compliance for most organizations, because user scope is how you define what roles users should play in your compliance. So users need to be able to see items and perform functions integral to their roles, but they also need to be restricted from those items and functions that they should not be able to access. And the interplay and balance between these two needs is essential to ensuring that users are empowered to fulfill their duties without giving them the keys to the kingdom, so to speak, and granting them access to areas of the system that are outside of the scope of their roles. So this is why this really matters. Now that we've covered, what user scope is overall and why it's important, I want to dig into some of the details of the components of user scope and important features to understand about those components. So the first thing that I want to talk about is the differences between permissions and security/access. I've got a chart here. I'm going to go through each of these differences. And the first one is that permissions are global and security and access are local. So what I mean here is that permissions grant power and abilities across the entire system, whereas security is local to folders, documents, and reports. Access is local to workflow definitions and workflow instances. So those security and access settings only apply to those places in the system. Each of your folders, you can configure the security. Each of your workflow definitions, you can configure the instance access and definition access specific to those workflows. Permissions are abilities that apply across the system. They're mostly granted to managers or admins. To help highlight this, I'm going to bring up the list of permissions. If you go to your help guide on the bottom left, you always have that link to the help guide. This is the instruction manual for Qualtrics, very useful resource if you want to find out details about how anything works in Qualtrics. If you go to administration, user management, and click on permissions, or you can just click on search and search for permissions there. This shows you a list of all the different permissions in the system. We're going to talk through some of these permissions because some of them are very important to know about how they affect your user scope. But I would just say, if you haven't looked at this list before, you should definitely read through these. If it's been a while since you've looked through them, it doesn't hurt to read through them. And I would also say, if you're configuring a new group or you're wanting to change the scope of one of your users or multiple users, it's a good idea to review some of these items if it's been a while and just kind of refresh your memory as you're configuring those settings. But the main takeaway here is just that permissions are those admin powers. They give someone the ability to do things that are very consequential. And most of the time, those powers are granted across the entire system or across large parts of the system. Sorry, my brain just stopped. Another difference too is that permissions are best managed through using groups, whereas security can only be managed using groups. So keep that in mind when you're configuring these things. You know, a lot of the stuff that we're talking about here with user scope, you can configure individually, but you will want to most of the time do that through groups. But like I said, security can only be managed through groups. Access is one of those things that it's very similar to security, but it actually can be managed individually if you need to. Again, on that, I'm talking about instance access and definition access to workflows, but using groups there is also recommended. And then the last difference I'll highlight here is that permissions aren't required to perform the core functions of Qualtrics, whereas local settings are required to interact with and perform functions on those areas in the system that those settings are local to. So all the basic functions in Qualtrics can be done by a user without any permissions if the security and other settings local to that item are configured appropriately. So let's say you have a user that has no permissions. Depending upon how you've configured your security, access, tasks, responsibilities, all those things elsewhere in the system, a user with no permissions could still view, edit, review, and approve documents. They could still complete tests and trainings. They could still run reports. They could launch workflows, and they could complete workflow steps that are assigned to them. All of these things can be done without any permissions. Another way to put this is all of those things I just described, those are configured elsewhere in the system. Permissions are something that's separate, something that's different. So now that I've highlighted the differences between permissions and security access, let's take a look at the interplay between permissions and security/access. So some permissions actually grant power or access, but also require accompanying security or access settings in addition to the permissions. So what I'm showing here are all of those different permissions that work in this way. All the ones you can see on screen, if someone has this permission, they also need local settings in the system to use this permission on those items. For example, alter tree. This one gives the user the ability to alter the document tree, do things like move the folders around or change the order of folders. But they can only do this to the folders that they have access to. If somebody doesn't even have view security to a folder, then they can't even see it to even know how it's ordered, let alone try and reorder it. So there are some permissions that require that additional layer of security in order to operate. And you'll notice a theme here too, that these are all related to documents and to the document control lifecycle. So for each of these, the user would need to have that security to the document in order to use this permission in that location, as well as folders. I'll demonstrate this with an example user. So I'm going to bring up James Bond here. So I'm logged in as James Bond. You can see here on the top right. And let's go to the document tree. You can see that James Bond has access to the MI6 folder naturally. And if I open this up, he can see the dossiers folder, the gear folder, and the subfolders within the gear folder. Now, James Bond has the alter tree permission. So this gear folder and its subfolders are the only folders that he has edit security to. So because of that, edit security plus alter tree, he could move these folders around. For example, if I wanted gadgets to be within cars, I could just drag and drop that. I could also move it back to gear. I can alter the tree. Now, if I try and take that gadgets folder and put it into the dossiers folder, nothing happens. And that's because James Bond doesn't have edit security to the dossiers folder. So this is an example of those layers. You need the alter tree permission, plus you need edit security to the folders that you're trying to alter. Now, in addition to some permissions requiring other settings in the system to function, other permissions actually override or overpower security and access settings. So I'll give you some examples of these. The first one is alter reports. And in fact, let me bring up this list of permissions here. So alter reports, this allows viewing and editing of all reports, regardless of their security settings, and also grants the ability to create, run, and schedule report instances. So I showed you how you can modify the security settings for your reports and control who can view them and who can edit them. But if someone has the alter reports permission, this overrides it. Another example is alter workflow instances. So this permission allows editing of a workflow instance at any step, regardless of access or responsible party settings on the workflow. So someone can go into a workflow step, even if it's not assigned to them, and they can modify the data in there. Not only that, let's say that you have a workflow where in step 1, there are fields that are editable, but those fields aren't editable in step 2, they're just viewable. Somebody who has alter workflow instances could pull up step 2 and edit those fields that are normally viewable, because they can edit any fields that are editable in a workflow in any step. So this one overrides some of those local settings. Now, it's also important to know with this specific permission that this can be disabled on individual workflows. If I go back to administration workflows and we go to this giant space laser workflow here, you can see in the workflow definition settings, there's this option for alter workflow instances permission disabled. If you check that box, then it means that this workflow is immune from people who have the alter workflow instances permission. And instance access will only be defined by what you put here in instance access. So this is another way that you can be more granular with your user scope control. You may have certain users that you want to be able to alter workflow instances for most of the workflows in your system, but you may also have some workflows that contain information that is so sensitive that you don't want people who have that permission to be able to edit it, that no one should be able to do that. So keep that in mind. The last permission I'll highlight here that can override or overpower security settings is the view, edit, all documents permission. And this does what it says on the tin. This grants the view and edit security across the entire system, regardless of security settings on folders or documents. So somebody who has view, edit, all documents can view and edit all the documents in the system. It also means necessarily they can see all the folders in your system. They just have complete access. So this is a very powerful permission that overrides those local settings. So it's important to understand, not only permissions and how they operate, but also how they work in conjunction with security and access. Now, I also want to highlight some permissions that I'll call super permissions. This isn't an official term or anything or a highly technical term, but this is what I'm kind of calling them for this session. So some permissions are incredibly powerful and should only be granted sparingly, if at all. Most users won't need these permissions that I'm about to tell you about. The first one of these is the data retention permission. This allows the deletion of documents, workflow instances, test instances, and training instances. Obviously, a huge part of compliance is record keeping. So if someone is able to delete records from your system like this, then that's kind of a big deal, right? That's why I would consider this one to be a super permission. Also know that once an item is deleted from the system, once a document, workflow instance, test instance, or training instance is deleted, it's gone forever. You cannot restore it. Not only that, for documents, if you're familiar with retiring documents, retiring a document just means it gets pulled out of your document tree. It's no longer active. You can't publish new revisions of it or edit it. But all the data for the document is saved. You can pull it up in searches. You can pull it up in reports. You can access all that data. It's all retained. If you delete a document, then it's not retained. That's why this is called data retention. This gives someone the ability to completely delete that data. The next super permission I'll highlight is the system setting administration permission. This grants the permission user access to settings for the system overall. And system settings modify functionality across the entire system. With this, I'm talking about things like what is the session timeout? How long can someone be idle before it signs them out of the system? You can also set up, document control options across your entire system. You can prohibit file extensions, like an exe or a zip file from being created anywhere in the system. So these are settings for the system overall, and that's why I would consider this one a super permission and why you want to be sparing with it. The next one I've already mentioned, which is view, edit all documents. This is a big one. Like I said, this grants the permission users view and edit security to every document in the system without exception, regardless of the security settings on those documents or folders. I don't mean to sound like a broken record on that. I just want to highlight this is a very powerful permission. Not very many people in your system most likely will need this. In some use cases, you may not want anyone to have this. So just be very careful with that permission. The last two I kind of grouped together, and those are groups administration and personnel administration. Now, at first glance, it may not be obvious why these are listed as super permission. The reason for this is these permissions allow the permissioned user to grant permissions. This is the permission that allows you to give people permissions. Groups administration allows you to grant permissions to groups. Personnel administration allows you to grant permissions to personnel, among other things. But that is why they are listed here as a super permission, because they are the permissions that allow you to grant permissions. They are effectively the most powerful permissions in the system, because users with either of these can grant any permissions to themselves or to others, regardless of how powerful those permissions are. Now, that's not to say that someone who has one or both of these permissions is going to do that, is going to go in and just start granting themselves or everyone else permissions. It's just important to know that that is something that they can do. This is something that I think about with user scope as well, is that there are a lot of things in Qualtrics itself that you can use to configure and to control that user scope. And that's what we're focusing on in this session, right? But obviously there are also some things that fall under the category of, training and internal policies and things like that. So all that's just to say that make sure that even the people that have permissions like groups administration, personnel administration, or really any of these really powerful permissions, make sure they understand how they are supposed to use those permissions in their role, so that way they understand the choices that they're making and the consequences of those choices. I'll also say about super permissions that some super permissions become even more powerful when combined with other super permissions. And I mean, this makes sense, right? If you have some really powerful permissions, if you kind of, combine them together, you may have even more powers and abilities. So one example of this is if someone has the data retention permission and the view, edit all documents permission, that means they can delete any and all documents in the system. Again, they're probably not going to do that, right? But it's important to know that if someone has both of those permissions, that is something they could do. They can see and edit every document in the system, and they can also delete documents, and that includes all the ones that they can edit, which is every document in your system. So familiarize yourself with permissions in general, but definitely with these super permissions. Check and see, who has them, and really think about, does everyone who has these permissions actually need them as part of their user scope? All right, so now that I've talked through, what user scope is, where you configure it, what the components of it are, I want to give you some examples of different users and their scopes to kind of solidify this. So our first example is Samantha. Samantha is one of the people in her organization responsible for workflow creation and administration. So one of her roles in the organization is workflow administrator. So she needs to be able to access existing workflow definitions in the system, change their settings, and create new workflows as well. So to perform her job duties, Samantha needs the workflow administration permission, as well as definition access to the workflow she's responsible for maintaining. However, because she is not responsible for monitoring or reporting on workflow instances, she does not need workflow instance access. Only people like managers or admins, typically speaking, will need to be able to access all instances of a workflow, and that's not part of her scope. She does, however, need the custom field administration permission to create and modify custom fields that are used in workflows. And then lastly, Samantha is designated as the effectiveness sign-off personnel for her organization's internal workflow creation training. So that way, when users do take that training and they submit it, Samantha is the one who confirms that the training was actually effective and that they understand the content. All right, let's talk about another example here. So Andre, in addition to his other duties, is also an administrator for Qualtrics overall within his organization. He is responsible for making changes to the system as well as assisting other users by utilizing his administrative powers. Andre needs the email action and email reminder administration permissions to create and modify the emails that their Qualtrics server sends out to their users. He also needs the groups administration and personnel administration, as well as out-of-office administration permissions, so he can create groups, create personnel in the system, and also assist users with password resets and out-of-office statuses. To round out his user scope, Andre also needs the scheduled tasks administration permission, standards administration, and system settings administration permission, so he can manage overall settings for his organization's Qualtrics server. You'll notice that Andre doesn't have any responsibilities listed here or even security and access. And that's because for this specific role of Qualtrics administrator, there are no additional responsibilities or security access assigned to it. Instead, all of Andre's responsibilities in security and access come from his primary job role. So user scope can include users being members of multiple groups and having multiple duties. Andre's full scope will also include his main job role, but I wanted to isolate this Qualtrics administrator role of his to show you that user scope doesn't always necessarily contain every one of those categories that I mentioned. Instead, those are some of the components you can use. And also that users may have sort of a cumulative scope that is all of the things that they can see and do. And then there are also scopes that make up those scopes. In this case, Andre is a Qualtrics administrator in addition to his primary role. All right, let's up the complexity a little bit here. Our next example user is Allison. I know there's a lot on screen, but Allison has a lot going on. And try not to get intimidated by how much is on here. I'm going to talk through each of these. So Allison is a team lead for her department, and she's responsible for many different things, such as screening new candidates, managing time off requests, ensuring her team members are properly trained, and creating and maintaining team documents. So to perform her job duties, Allison needs the personnel administration permission, so she can add new hires to the system and add those users to existing groups. But she does not need the groups administration permission because she will not be creating or modifying groups. She also needs to be the responsible party for the review request step of her organization's time off request workflow. To manage the out-of-office statuses for her employees, she needs the out-of-office administration permission. Additionally, she needs the testing and training administration permission to be able to create and assign tests and trainings to her staff, and to set herself as the completion sign-off personnel for trainings specific to her team, as well as the view test instances and view training instances permissions to be able to review completed tests and trainings for members of her team. Allison also needs view security to the testing results and training matrix reports, as well as the create reports permission to create new custom reports around activity within her team. Because she is responsible for documents in her department, she needs to be designated as an approver for those documents. She needs view and edit security to her department's folders and documents. And there are also a few other miscellaneous permissions that she needs, such as alter document variables, document manager, and even view archived revisions. So I wanted to show this example to show you that even for your users that have a lot of things that fall within the scope of their role, there are still limits oftentimes to the scope, right? Allison is responsible for and can do a lot of things, but she doesn't have infinite scope in the system. There are limitations to what she can do. She doesn't have groups administration. She doesn't have view, edit all documents. These things are outside of the scope of her role within her organization. So even if someone needs to be able to do a lot of things, you'll still want to be mindful about how you define their scope. And you won't necessarily want to give someone an infinite scope or give them access to everything just in case they need it. You'll still want to think through what that scope should be and define it clearly. All right, let's go to an example that is a little bit less complex. So Stephen is an instrument technician in his organization. He accesses Qualtrics regularly to view documents related to his role, take tests and trainings assigned to him, and complete workflow tasks. So in order to accommodate this, Stephen is a member of the instrument technician group, which controls most of his scope in Qualtrics. Stephen has view security to the folders and documents specific to his role, and is also a reviewer for some of those documents so he can provide feedback on upcoming revisions. If changes are made to those documents, they will probably affect the work that Stephen does. So he's a reviewer so he can offer his feedback about those upcoming changes. Additionally, he is a test taker for acknowledgement tests associated with documents specific to his role, and a training attendee for annual safety trainings. Stephen is a responsible party for the first step of the corrective action workflow, so he can create new instances of it as needed. As for permissions, Stephen doesn't require very many at all to perform his job duties. The only permissions he has are view archived revisions to allow him to see all previous revisions of a document to which he has view security, and view personnel to grant him access to the personnel screen so he can see general information about personnel in the system. So both of these permissions that he has are some of the least consequential permissions in the system. View archived revisions and view personnel, these are both view permissions. They don't give him the ability to modify these things at all. He can just see them. So this is sort of the opposite end of the spectrum in some ways from the example of Allison. Stephen has a lot of stuff that he can do. There are a lot of things that do fall within the scope of his role. There are a lot of things he's responsible for. There are a lot of documents that he can access. There's tests and trainings that he needs to take. There's workflows that he can launch. But his scope is fairly limited. So this is an example of someone can have a fairly limited scope, but still be able to do a lot of stuff. So I hope that these different examples have helped illustrate the possibilities of ways you can configure your scope for your users. I know that when people are setting up their system, or even when they've had it for a while and they're kind of configuring things, it may not be immediately apparent how all of these different settings work together. A lot of admins know how to create and modify groups, right? And they know how to change the document lists, the approval, review, and notify lists. They know how to change security. But what I'm suggesting is to think about all of these things as part of a whole. Think of user scope holistically. This will really help you define those settings in such a way that your users can see and do what they need to in the system, but not be able to see and do things that they shouldn't be able to. So now that we've talked through that, there are some final thoughts and tips that I would like to leave you with. Also, while I'm doing this, if you have any questions that you'd like me to answer at the end of the session here, go ahead and place those into the attendee hub. So the first thing is to just say again, to familiarize yourself with all the permissions and security settings in the system. Read through the permissions list and the descriptions to familiarize yourself with them. These are critical to controlling the scope of users in your Qualtrics system. I would also say make sure that all of your admins who can grant permissions are familiar with them and how they operate. Make sure all of your admins who have any kind of powers in the system know what those powers are, how they work, what the consequences of those powers are, and what they should and should not do. I would also say that you should be very deliberate when configuring your security, access, and other settings that affect user scope. And typically it's best to start conservatively and then broaden user scope as needed. I know sometimes, I touched on this earlier, sometimes people will create a group for a role, or grant someone permissions or access and think, well, I'll give this to them in case they need it. And depending upon your organization and your needs and how things are structured, that might be just fine for what your needs are. But oftentimes it's best to not grant things to people just in case they need it. If someone has a broadened scope, if part of their scope is that they can do things that they don't normally do and don't know much about, then there's a higher likelihood that they could make a consequential choice and not even realize the effects of what they're doing, what the ramifications of that are. So start conservatively and then expand from there as needed. It's usually best, let's say you have a user that comes to you and says, as part of my job role, I should be able to do X, but I can't. Okay, you can go in and look at the settings and evaluate whether or not their scope needs to be broadened. That's usually a lot better than someone being like, well, I can do this thing, so it must not be that big of a deal. And then, they accidentally delete something or what have you. And then you have to narrow their scope because there were consequences for their action. So keep that in mind. I would also just say again, to be especially sparing with those super permissions. Chances are not very many users in your system need those. There are a lot of permissions in the system because there are a lot of different settings and things you can control, and Qualtrics is highly configurable. So keep that strength of the software in mind. The reason that you have so many permissions is so that you can be very specific with what users should be able to do. It's not the case that they're all in there because you should just kind of give them out to everybody. Be sparing with those super permissions. And lastly, I touched on this just a moment ago, but thoroughly train all of your users on their roles in Qualtrics and the scope of those roles. I mean, this goes in conjunction with the training that you're already doing for your users, for your staff. You already train people on what the scope of their role is within the organization. Training them on their scope within Qualtrics is also important. If someone knows what they can and can't do, and what they should and should not do, then you've got a much better chance of them staying within that, right? And not making decisions that can impact your compliance in ways that you don't want. All right. So we've got a little bit of time left here at the end of the session for questions. I see a couple that have been placed in here. So I do see one of them that's already been answered, but I want to expand on it a little bit. The question is, when you delete something, it asks for comments. Is there an audit to see what was deleted and the comments that were made? And so the answer to that is the data retention activity report under the system reports tab. So that's where you can access that information. It's also important to note that nothing else is retained about the document. All you can see is the information that shows up there. And in fact, I'll demonstrate this for you. So let's go to reports, go to the system tab, and there's that data retention activity report. If you run that, you can see the items that have been deleted from the system. This includes documents, workflows, tests, and trainings. Now, this is a demo server, all right? So this isn't a true example of a lot of times what you'll see in this report. Let's see if we can find one that's a bit more apropos. Okay, the reason that I'm saying this, you can see the deletion reasons are very sparse in here. I would say don't do that. It's only because this is a demo server that this is the case. But these are the only pieces of data that are retained for deleted items. The module that they are a part of, so workflow, test, trainings, documents, the ID number it had when it was in the system, what the title of it was, when it was published or completed, when it was deleted, who deleted it, and what that deletion reason was. Those comments that you fill in, that's the deletion reason. And it's typically best, what we recommend is to be very specific in that deletion reason. Be detailed. I like to write it from the perspective of if I was having an audit, especially an external audit, and someone looked at this document that was deleted and they read the deletion reason, would it be enough to answer the questions that they have or to satisfy them to know, oh, okay, this makes sense? You know, if I've created a document, for example, that I'm using as an example to test something out or to train someone on something, in the deletion reason, I'll put, you know, this was an example document. It was created for training. It didn't contain any real data. It was no longer needed. I feel like, you know, that may sound like excessive, right? But because this is some of the only data that's retained for that document, it's a good idea to be very specific and detailed. So think of it from that perspective. If someone had a question about that being deleted, does the deletion reason answer most of those questions or allay any concerns that they may have about it? All right, the next question is, would a person who makes workflows also need the email action administration so the workflow can send the emails if chosen to do so while creating the workflows? That is a really good question. So the short answer is no. Someone doesn't need the email action administration permission in order for the workflows that they're creating or editing to send emails. And what the questioner is talking about is, if we go to administration workflows, we'll use, again, that giant space laser as an example. If I bring this up, you can see when you add new routes, you can put in the title, the step that it leads from and the step that it leads to. And there's also this checkbox here for create email action. Now, that's the way to have the system automatically create them. So if you check this box and you click add route, then the system will go ahead and just generate an email action for you. It will be based on the template that is under the System Settings Administration tab, and it will attach it to this route. And what it's going to do is it's going to send that email to whoever the responsible parties are for the step that this route leads to. And the way that default email is set up out of the box with your Qualtrics server is it's a template that basically covers pretty much every possible scenario for a workflow. It just says, this workflow has been assigned to you. Log into Qualtrics to complete the task. So most of the time, if you've got workflow administration and you're creating workflow or modifying it, you're adding in routes, this is pretty much all you'll need to create those email actions and use them in that workflow. Now, if you do have the email action administration permission, then you do have more access. You can do more with this. If I go to administration email actions, then I could manually add in email actions here. And I can also configure more settings for those email actions. In fact, you can see that there are some email actions in here for workflows. If I click edit on one of these, you can see this kind of template content for this email. Here's the title, here's the ID. It's got information specific to that workflow instance, but it's fairly generic. If I wanted to change who the recipients are, if I wanted to add in different environment variables or edit the content of this email, then for that, you would need email action administration. But you don't need it to create those default email actions that are attached to routes. Furthermore, if you needed to be able to edit what that template is, and again, the text that we see here in the subject and body is what's in that template, to edit that, you would need the System Settings Administration permission. That's what grants the ability to do that. So that's why I said the short answer was no, but the longer answer is a bit more nuanced depending upon what you need to be able to do. I would say in most cases, the people that are going to be modifying, creating your workflows, they probably don't need email action administration. They just need to be able to create those email actions for the routes. And then if they say, well, this email action needs to be edited, they could just go to someone who has the email action administration or put in a request through whatever means you have internally so that the person that has those permissions can go in and then modify that email action as needed. Yeah, really good question. We've still got some more time here, so anybody has any questions, please place those into the attendee hub. It can be anything having to do with user scope, any components of it, any specific or even general questions you have about ways to configure scope or suggestions on that. We'll give a little time here for people to place those questions into the attendee hub if you would like. No more questions? Okay. All right. If there are no more questions, I'd like to thank you all for attending this training session. I hope that this has given you some things to think about with how you configure your system. I know that user scope is sort of an ephemeral concept, and I hope that I've helped make it more solid for you and make more sense about how to think about these things. Sorry, I had an error on mine. I didn't know what was happening there. So if you have any questions after this session, you can send them to the services team. That's the team that I'm on. So just email services@qualtrics.com. We'll be happy to answer any questions you have. If you need technical assistance, if you have specific technical questions, you can also send those to the support team, support@qualtrics.com, and they can assist you with that. So thank you all again for attending. I hope you have a great day and enjoy the rest of the conference.